Throughout the 18th, 19th, and 20th century, or season 1 of capitalism, capitalism spread like an unstoppable juggernaut. As an ideology, it was challenged by Marxism, fascism, communism, every different kind of ism that you could think of. But none of these isms were capable of providing an ideologically sound alternative. It would seem that capitalism had become the de facto method to spread prosperity and to ensure democracy. But in season 2, things began to change, once again because of conflict. In the early 80s, following the outbreak of the Iraq-Iran war and the subsequent oil embargo, the economies of developed nations began to suffer. Industry started grinding to a halt, and unemployment started to rise. The US government, which was headed by Ronald Reagan, and the UK government, which was headed by Margaret Thatcher, realized that they needed to come up with radical new ways in order to spur economic growth and remain in power. So they did something very interesting. They decided to privatize industries. They were essentially doing the same thing which King James had done around 300 years back. They took economic decision-making power away from the democratically elected state, and they gave it to Wall Street. But they also did something which King James had not done. They removed the regulations for banks in order for them to lend money, or they made it easier. Now, the logic behind doing this was quite simple. If people were not able to work the same amount and gain the same revenue and maintain the same lifestyle that they were accustomed to, they could borrow their way to it. Seemed very feasible, seemed very logical. But once again, this had massive effects on the culture of society. Previously, capitalism had made society more porous and more fluid, and had allowed a large number of people in society to access new kinds of opportunities. This is why prosperity spread more easily. But this time, in season 2, capitalism was changed because prosperity could now be attained via debt. If you could not earn the revenue that you needed to, you could lend. Debt became an intrinsic part of maintaining our capitalistic culture. Over a period of 30 years, once again, it was debt that became intertwined with capitalism. And this, once again, became a cultural standard and changed a lot of the things regarding the way our societies work. It led to increased deregulation of banks. It led to increasing amounts of public and private debt. And most importantly, it led to something a lot more disturbing. It led to the accumulation of capital in the hands of a very small group of people. Not only were the people who were able to benefit the most from the deregulation of banks and the privatization of industries able to extract the maximum benefit from society's prosperity, but they weren't even contributing anything to it. That responsibility was instead handed over to people who don't have accounts in tax havens, people like you and me. The effect of debt becoming part of our capitalistic culture is the primary reason that we have growing amounts of inequality in our societies today. How did this happen? How did we go from using capitalism as a means of generating and spreading prosperity to a means of creating a self-imposed hedonistic prison in which an increasing amount of people find themselves with unsustainable amounts of debt? There's 2 reasons for that. The first is clarity. Although we have access to the repository, instantaneous access to the repository of all human knowledge, we don't really have access to the activities of what the banks and the financial institutions are doing. That's why every time we see one of these financial scandals, it's a big surprise. And the surprising part is it's getting more and more frequent. We don't react with the same amount of shock because we're getting used to it. The second issue is trust. Most of us don't really understand how the financial system works. So we have outsourced our trust to the people who are supposed to make the system function, the banks and the financial institutions. The reason that debt has become part of our capitalistic culture is simply because we have outsourced trust at the expense of clarity. Let me repeat that again. We have outsourced trust at the expense of clarity. So if you want to get capitalism to work for society again, you have to get this balance of clarity and trust back into kilter. Capitalism is a very unique thing in a number of ways, and the blockchain is the new technology that is coming and having an impact on it. What I am going to try and explain to you today is why do you need to understand it? And to help me, I've got my little friend over there. Now, what's the first reaction when you see this adorable little guy? Oh, obviously. The next reaction. And the next reaction is you want to take a picture, you want to copy-paste it, you want to send it to your friend, blah, blah, blah. The reason that we do this is because the cost of sending information on the internet is very, very low. The internet is a network which is decentralized and completely distributed. So if you want to share any kind of information, whether it's a cat pic, or if it's an Excel file, or a PDF, or an email, you can copy-paste that and send it to someone else because of this distributed architecture. That's why the cost of sharing information has come down dramatically in the past 2 to 3 decades. But when it comes to money, you can't use the same formula. Turns out that if I use the internet to engage in a financial transaction with one of you, then it's really, really important that you or someone else isn't capable of going and copying those strings of zeros and ones, which essentially make up the financial transaction that I'm sending. That you're not capable of copying that and pasting it and sending it to someone else. That's why we use banks. Banks essentially do 2 functions. Firstly, they're ensuring that I have the funds necessary to make this transfer. The second thing they're doing is updating our balance sheets once it's done. In my case, it's obviously going to get debited. In your case, it will be credited. It's also the reason that we have outsourced our trust to them. But it's an expensive one, in case any of you are wondering how much the average cost is. But the blockchain flips this. What the blockchain does is, rather than using a bank to validate a transaction, it uses the network. More specifically, it uses the computers that are on this network to perform a very simple or very complicated mathematical operation. And this mathematical operation is essentially doing the same 2 things. It's ensuring that I have the funds necessary to make the transfer, and once the transfer is done, it updates the balance sheets. But instead of counting on a bank, it counts on the transparency of the network. To ensure trust in such a system, the blockchain makes every transaction that happens on this network recorded and published on a shared balance sheet, which is accessible by everyone who is on this network. Rather than outsourcing the trust to another bank, it outsources the trust through transparency. Remember, when you share information with the internet, the cost of sharing information goes down. Well, if you're going to use a blockchain, which is also a distributed system, the cost of making a transaction goes down exponentially. So not only is it able to provide us with a greater way of seeing what's going on within a system, it also ensures trust and reduces the cost of doing so. This is why The Economist calls the blockchain the trust machine, and why I like to call it the engine of transparency. Moreover, apart from addressing the 2 problems that we mentioned about capitalism, which is clarity and trust, the blockchain also provides 2-way transparency. Today, banks and financial institutions have massive amounts of clarity in terms of what we do with our money. But we don't have the same clarity as they do. With the blockchain, since every transaction has to be published on the shared balance sheet, for the first time, as banks know us, we get the chance to know them. Just as banks know their customers, we now have the opportunity to know our banks, and more importantly, to know our governments. This has been unprecedented till today. And I specify today simply because of one reason. The timing has to be right. Capitalism has been punctuated by events that have massive effects on the future of society. We are at such a landmark event today as we enter season 3 with the blockchain. In recent years, especially in the last year, there's been an increasing amount of investment by banks, financial institutions, and governments in the blockchain because they want to leverage the ability to make transactions with very reduced cost. But as they pursue this hedonistic goal, it offers us a window of opportunity. For the first time, we have the opportunity to see the interactions that are actually happening within our capitalistic system. For the first time, we have the possibility to witness capitalism and to see its effects on society as it happens in real time. The title of this talk is Rethinking Capitalism with a Blockchain. But as we come to the end of it, what this conversation has really been about is not about the blockchain or capitalism. What this talk is about is questions. We need to question our banks and ask them to be transparent with us just as we are with them. We need to use this technology and question how can we use it in order to reduce inequality that is plaguing our societies today. More importantly, we need to question ourselves and ask ourselves, how are we going to use this technology and together redefine capitalism? After all, it is only by asking these questions that we can have the right conversations. With the right conversations, we can have the right interactions, and it is interactions that create culture and therefore capitalism, not the other way around. We have to start asking these questions, because if we do not ask these questions and have the right interactions, we will never be able to sever the link between conflict and capitalism. If we do not ask these questions and have these interactions, we will, I fear, be obliged to start a conversation with the next generation by beginning with an apology. And that, ladies and gentlemen, will not do. It is interactions that make culture, and it is culture that makes capitalism. I think the time has come that we start having these interactions so that we can redefine capitalism for this new era. Thank you.